as a kid, I remember being into turtles. I remember watching the cartoon and stuff. But if you ask me to recall anything about the Ninja Turtles like now, it's like really hard for me to remember. But I do know the games, and especially the arcade games, because like every time you go someplace and they had like the Turtles, it was always, if any arcade place had the Turtles game or the X-Men game, oh man, that was awesome. It's super iconic. It's really cool to get to learn all of these differences between the different versions and stuff, because I'll tell you right now, when people used to talk about Hyperstone Heist, the Turtles on the NES, or like this one, I always got them all confused. I'm like, I cannot tell you which one is which, but now I can tell you which one is which.
That's exactly right. And let's dive into that further, because for this dev story, I don't have anything that's specific to the developer outside of the fact that there's major differences and minor differences, yet at the same time they're pretty much the same game. For Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, right here. Turtles in Time, the arcade game, that's the original one. And then Turtles 4, the Hyperstone Heist, which was for the Sega Genesis. So let's go ahead and jump into that a little bit. The original Turtles arcade game, it was literally dedicated so it could be a 4-player cabinet. That was the want that they had. They did also eventually make a 2-player conversion kit, so that way it was going to be easier for them to distribute it in Japan, because Japan was limited in space, because Japan's not as big, obviously, with a little more spaciousness out here in the States. Arcades are a big deal. Arcades are a huge deal in Japan. Well, they want to be able to fit more. And sometimes that means sacrificing space for some of the ideal things, like maybe having the 4-player cabinet, and instead they wanted to be able to have a 2-player cabinet. And that's where that came into play. Here is something I thought was really cool and at the same time very interesting. The SNES version was retitled Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 to keep to the idea of Turtles 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's how the US was selling all those, keeping those numerically in order. That was for North America and Australia. However, in Europe, it's called Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles 4, Turtles in Time. The Europe also wanted to keep up with the numbering aspect of it as well, which is funny because in Europe did not get a PAL region release for Turtles 3, the Manhattan Project. So for Europe, it goes Turtles 1, 2, 4. Like, wait, what?
Trying to, like, when you were talking about it earlier and like the Japanese differences, it's like trying to figure out the differences with like Final Fantasy 2 and Final Fantasy 4 and 6, and you're like, one is one, you're like, wait a minute, roll that back.
I'm confused. Is that one this? Okay, that one is, wait. Yeah, exactly right. The SNES version is missing some of the animation and graphics like we were talking about earlier from the arcade version. But like we were talking about, the Mode 7 and the scrolling effect, specifically in Neon City Knight Riders, changes the over-the-shoulder perspective. Being able to throw foot soldiers directly at and hitting the screen is what allowed it to be such a mainstay. It turned what would normally be most ports coming from arcades are the dumbed down or less attributable versions. Well, people are like, it's a good game, but you should really play the arcade. This is one of the few games ever in the SNES, let alone SNES or before, where they kept up with, if not improved upon, what the arcade wanted to do. So the SNES version is now missing certain voice samples because, again, they couldn't do full voices. They had to have those replaced with an instrumental version of the cartoon because they could go ahead and use those sounds and beeps and boops and whatnot to create the theme, but they couldn't do the same thing with the voice. They say those for very specific aspects, such as pizza time. That's why some of those sound effects, when they say something, you're like, I hear ya, but at the same time, it sounds kind of funny. While the only thing that really sounds legitimate is cowabunga. Again, though, that cowabunga is still not being said. It's what they're using with tones. The alterations made to the SNES's version of gameplay, like Sewer Surfing and Neon Knight Riders, they changed them to the bonus levels like we were talking about earlier. And then they added a Technodrome level. That level does not exist at all in the arcade version. The arcade version, when you go back and play it, it's actually way more confusing than you thought. It goes Sewer City Surfing, and then out of nowhere, Shredder just, his big old head appears, and he's all like, ha ha ha, Turtles, I trapped you, and I'm sending you back in time where you belong. And then it goes from the prehistoric Turtlesaurus forward, and you're just like, wait, what?
Huh?
Now, maybe as a kid, you just would have let it slide because everything was so cool and in your face, awesome. So therefore, you might have been like, no big deal. But now, more as an adult, I'm like, this really makes no freaking sense.
probably just so excited to be playing as a turtle in a video game.
Yes.
You're like, oh, whatever.
Whatever, let's just go. Come on, take me back in time. Take me to the future. I don't care. In the Technodrome, there's a big old screen display. So now when his face pops up on there, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, and now that big old screen, that's where this big old time warp is located. Again, it makes sense. Even if you don't believe in time warp, at least up until that point, you're like, I follow what you're doing. I get it. Here is the other aspect that the Super Nintendo was so good about compared to the arcade, the bosses. Here's a boss. Everyone, what boss do you expect to happen in prehistoric Turtlesaurus? Anyone have a guess off the top of their head if they do know or don't know? Triceratops would have been a great actual one. They just never used it in the video games at all, even though it was a very integral part of the comic book series. It was Slash. Slash looks like a prehistoric version of the turtle. Not smooth at all, very rigid, very Well, here's the one that they used instead for the arcade, Cement Man. Cement Man is a part of the series. Cement Man is one of the enemies the turtles fight, but it really does not fit. Cement was not created in 65 million BC.
Yeah, that's weird.
It's like, okay, what an interesting aspect to throw into there. Cement Man would have been better put on one of the levels that has cement in it.
Yeah, maybe one of the city levels, you know, where they're in New York City or something.
Just saying. So that was an interesting aspect that they did to it that was thrown off. Now, he looks just like one of the enemies from Batman. Absolutely. I'm curious to figure out which one came first between those two. That would be a good one to look into. Here's something we were talking about earlier when at the end of Sewer City Surfin', where you get warped in the arcade version to back in time compared to going to the Technodrome. There's actually a boss on the Super Nintendo version. You fight the Rat King. In the arcade version, you just have a bunch of pizza monsters that go flying across the screen back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's okay. Again, as a kid, the first time playing it, you're like, wow, this is cool. I love my life. But now, when you're able to question it, that was not that cool. I don't feel rewarded for that fight. Those ones that they missed on. Now, remember, they added the Technodrome level for the Super Nintendo version. So the Technodrome level, that has Razar and Taka as a part of it. Those two bosses are actually on the ship level, but in the Super Nintendo version, again, this is the key thing to me to make a game good for turtles, you should have both Bebop and Rocksteady. They were the lovable goons. They were better than foot soldiers. They were kind of little doofy. You know, sometimes they would fight each other more than they fight the turtles. That was great. That was a lot of fun. It was enjoyable to see them go through those shenanigans. And that's actually an Easter egg as a part of the Super Nintendo version that you have to fight both bosses. But if you just beat one of them, they start fighting each other like, what's wrong with you? Why did you let me down? And they fight each other, and then the boss fight's over. The game tricks you into thinking you have to fight both of them, because as soon as one stops fighting you, it shows the other one's full health bar. But you don't have to fight that one. Just go fight the other one that you almost defeated, and then once that one's done, you can move on from it. You do not have to beat both of them. And then finally, y'all just saw just a moment ago, Super Shredder is the final boss, right? Let me show you what they did for the arcade version if you don't remember. Here's Shredder wielding a lightsaber. I love Star Wars, folks. I love it, but I love it as a part of the Star Wars universe. Why does Shredder have a lightsaber? Especially in 1992. That's what the year they come back into the normal time, and that's what it is there. It's funny because the Super Nintendo version has that as 1993 because the game wasn't released until 93 then. That's two differences between the arcade and the SNES version is this final level has a different year for it. In 1992, you're wielding a lightsaber, huh?
And he's not even wielding like a Sith one. He's like got like a Jedi lightsaber.
Supposedly he's a Jedi. He's a good guy. Maybe the turtles are bad guys.
Maybe we had it wrong all along.
Yeah. Here's the thing. You might be right about that, Ash. We might have got it wrong all along because in Europe, ninjas were no good. If ninjas were no good, maybe you're right. This entire time we should be worried that we're the bad guy.
Maybe in an alternate turtle life timeline. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're right.
They felt that the name ninja and then specifically the weapon of nunchucks were creating more violence. Go back and watch Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze, and there's a scene where Michelangelo grabs, it's either sausages or pepperonis, one of the two, and just starts wielding them around. They are nunchucks. that entire scene was cut from the European release.
When Jen told me about that earlier, I was like, really? That is something else.
Like, it's like, wait, they even took that out? He wasn't hitting anyone with it. At most, he hit himself with it. And ninjas were considered to be violent, and kids shouldn't be exposed to those kinds of things. It's so funny. Out of all the weapons, not the blades, not these scythes that will like, pierce you, but nunchucks were the big no-nos.
And not even actual nunchucks.
Yeah, not even real ones. Meat. You can't even pretend. No faux
Yo.
nunchucks for you. We talked about the arcade differences. We talked about the Super Nintendo differences. Let's finish this devs portion, the Genesis version, because I bet there's a bunch of you out there right now are like, wait, you need to talk about Hyperstone Heist a little bit more. The controls for Turtles in Time, the Hyperstone Heist, were similar, but remember earlier we were talking about there being if you took it off automatic, you could put it on a manual dash, and that's going to be using the D-pad and doing a double tap, create your sprint. If you notice, we got a 4-button setup here. For a Sega controller, it's a 3-button setup, unless you have the 6-button one, but the 3-button setup, one of those buttons was a dedicated dash button. The other two were your jump or your attack, and so if you were doing a super, you would have hit 2 buttons at the same time to do your super. Like we talked about earlier, you could reprogram these natively on the options menu for the Super Nintendo version. That was a little bit different because now you have a dedicated dash button. You cannot throw enemies at the screen in this game. From a speedrunner's perspective, it was very sad because throwing an enemy at the screen is the quickest way you can kill an enemy in the entire game. No, that's a speedrunner's complaint. We'll move forward. The game shares nearly the same soundtrack, but it is done better. Why? Because the Genesis was a stronger system, and they put more emphasis on having the ability to play music at a much higher capacity. I got my Genesis modded to be able to, have smoother lines for the game so that they're much tighter, but also even just improving the power supply, improve the sound quality, because it's getting enough power to make sure that it's always playing all those notes at an optimal amount of output, because sometimes it's making sure not to take too much from the power supply because it doesn't want the thing to crash on. I'm sure anyone's out there playing a game every now and then, like, the game just reset itself. I don't know why, but it did. It crashed. It finally hit a little bit too much, and instead of just melting the game or whatever, it's like, crash, come back up. It's like, oh. So those kind of things started to matter. So that's what the difference here in the Genesis version. We talked about some of those aspects. There are fewer than half the levels in Hyperstone Heist than in Turtles in Time. There's only 6 total levels you go in, but
Really?
they are very long levels. And each one of those levels will have a transition screen where pretty much you are playing all those levels condensed into long versions of what would be normally numerous levels, which also meant less boss fights too. Now, the Hyperstone Heist enemies AI was actually much more aggressive and faster moving as overall gameplay too. And one of the differences as well in this game, Hyperstone Heist, compared to the Super Nintendo versions, when you see lasers on the screen and you do something like a backslide move, in the Super Nintendo version, the hitbox of the laser extends all the way to the ground and then a certain amount up into the air. In the Hyperstone Heist version, if you did a backslide, you could go under the lasers unhindered the entire time. And so that was a really cool aspect to be like, I can slide under these lasers? This is awesome. Yeah. That was a really cool aspect to it, where it's like, it gave you that ability, like, hey, obviously if in real life, if I dealt with that, I'd either go over or under. And you could go under safe. Now, there was 5 total levels in the Hyperstone Heist: New York City, a mysterious ghost ship, Shredder's hideout, the Gauntlet, and Final Shell Shock. I think I said 6, so sorry, folks, it's 5. Now, these were specifically created for Hyperstone Heist. There's only a couple of pieces. Alley Cat Blues is a part of one of the levels. Shredder's hideout, there's a little bit from Shredder's hideout in there. From the Final Shell Shock, you got aspects of the Technodrome and the elevator scene as a part of that. But otherwise, most of it was made specifically for Hyperstone Heist.
So you're going to get a different experience if you play Hyperstone Heist versus Turtles in Time.
Big time. Because now with limited levels, you also have limited bosses. So your bosses actually start out with Leatherhead. You want the easiest Leatherhead to fight against in any single Turtles game ever? Play Hyperstone Heist. Any other version of Turtles, Leatherhead normally is the boss with the most health that is not the final boss.
Oh.
And because Leatherhead normally has what's called an extended extended iframe sequence, in almost every other title, the idea behind it is that a gator will always beat a turtle. If you were to beat Leatherhead, it was to be this big accomplishment that a turtle could somehow overcome an alligator.
Wow.
So with that in mind, Leatherhead actually is the first boss, which, as we always know, usually the first boss is a boss that kind of gets you into it, usually has the least amount of health, and then it starts to scale. Okay, boss number 2 was Rocksteady. All right, like we talked about earlier, you gotta have Rocksteady and Bebop. The third boss was Tatsu. Now, if you don't recognize that name, think back to the films. Tatsu is the second in command behind Shredder.
He's the guy that's like this a lot of the time. Yes.
He is the other instructor there that is not Shredder, teaching the ways of the art of all the different karate and then some for martial arts for the Foot Clan. So he's in that. So they made sure to involve that one, which I thought was really cool because that's the only game you're going to find Tatsu in, a non-fan made game. Then you have Baxter Stockman, Krang, and Super Shredder. Wait, that's all the bosses? You said Rocksteady. Where's Bebop? There is no Bebop in this one for whatever reason. Like, you know what? We really like Rocksteady, but we're not down to have that pig in there. Nope, definitely not. No Bebop for you. So I have no clue why they didn't choose Bebop to be a part of it. That was the Hyperstone Heist little fill-in, is that they did not complete the full circuit of what I explained to you. When you make a good turtle game, make sure you have both Bebop and Rocksteady. They almost did it. They were so close.
What a shame. I definitely have some cool stuff to share too for the dev story of Streets of Rage.
Let's hear it.
I was able to find an interview with one of the devs of... Sorry, I feel like I'm about to sneeze. That's why I'm kind of slowing down.
You're
it just won't come out.
I had to deal with the same thing when I felt like I had to burp or whatever. I was like, uh-oh, I need to stop myself.
Streets of Rage 1 was developed and produced by Sega. First of all, let me tell you, I didn't even know that Streets of Rage was like a first-party Sega title. I just thought, I was just like, oh, it's like a cool Sega game. Sega had like, you know, Sonic and like a bunch of like things that was like first-party. I was like, oh, Streets of Rage is first-party. That's pretty cool. It was developed and produced by Sega. And then parts 2 and 3 was produced by Ancient. 4 was done by .emu, which I can't wait to get into that later. So Noriyoshi Oba had the idea to make Streets of Rage, Final Fight, and Street Fighter, which we talked about earlier. There's lots of heavy influence. They wanted to make a game that was going to stand out for them, and that's how like they did like all the things with like making the sprites bigger, making sure multiplayer was involved, and all that other stuff. The game is designed for players to prevent enemies from swarming and also to be 2-player, a major draw defining the characteristics from the other games. That was like the main thing that they wanted to make sure they did. I think that they succeeded. Everybody is able to remember Streets of Rage from its distinct style versus like some of the other games, even though they kind of borrowed from all that other stuff. For Streets of Rage 2 and 3, Ancient company that developed this game, Ayano and Yuzo Koshiro, they were brother and sister, and they used to work for this other company called Nihon Falcon. For whatever reason, they left that company. I guess maybe they wanted to have like more artistic control or whatever. They wanted to be able to develop their own stuff. They left and then created their own company together. And even their mom was a part of the company, which I thought was really cool. You know, talking about gaming in the family. Well, like my mom and my dad, like I thought that was like super cool to hear that their mom was also a part of that. They still produce games to this day. They still work together to this day. Also, what I thought was really cool, I know you were talking about before not being able to play like a game all the way through if you play on easy mode or whatever. In Streets of Rage 2 and 3, they specifically in the American version made the normal mode way more harder than even the hardest mode of the Japanese version. What? Why did they do that? Come on. Like you were saying before, like those cultural differences, the renting kind of thing, like, you know, like that trend of like people renting video games or whatever. They made the normal mode very, very difficult. Ayano became graphic designer and art director for Streets of Rage 2. And she said in her interview, her biggest challenge was adding variety to the stages and the versus mode in Streets of Rage 2 and the diagonal scrolling that they added. Those were some challenges they had, not only because it was tough to to develop, but they had, you know, they had limited time resources, mostly because of like the time resource they had, but like, and also being able to fit everything into the game. They said that the controls were also inspired by the fourth stage. She said controls also inspired fourth stage with the egg. Oh, the egg thing that's in there, they were inspired, I guess, like they wanted to make sure that they had those elements in there, and because of the way the game was made, they had to like do some finagling to make sure that that stuff was added into the game. The enemies, Jack and Beano. Oh, this was really cool. The enemies, Jack and Beano, because like all of the enemies in the game had names. They would use like the developers who were working on the game, they would use their names as names of the characters in the game. But there were two characters that she specifically could recall called Jack and Beano, and they were named after soybean candies that they used to love to eat at that time. Looking at stuff like that, you're like, why is this character named Beano? I always used to wonder that, like, why the heck was this character called Beano? Like, that is such a weird name for a character. Oh yeah, it's named after a candy. It's like, oh, that makes sense. A soybean candy. Yeah, duh. Okay. Quality of work they got out of the sourcing was so subpar, kind of touched on this earlier, that Ayano ended up fixing it herself. The deadlines were also a constant issue, and she said in an interview that she recalls crying, not like little tears. Like she said she recalled bawling, like on the phone when she was with Sega, because like they wanted the game out. They wanted the game sooner. They wanted like some deadlines to happen, but they were having those issues with the outsourcing, and she had to go back and fix stuff because everybody, the whole team was really putting their heart and soul into it. She was like remembering like being really upset that they were rushing them to finish this game. They didn't want to just give them like some crappy piece of product. They wanted to make sure that they were giving something that was going to be good. But she said she remembered like being on the phone, crying and being like, no, we have to like work on this game and stuff like that. I guess she ended up meeting the deadline. They didn't end up cutting whatever it is that she was working on. So, and they said that playtesting and working on things was on the spot was a big part of the culture of working on the game Streets of Rage 2. For the staff, Streets of Rage 2 was a passion and work of love, and they would work really long hours, like what probably we're not really used to doing, but they would work really long hours and probably like stay into the office like way longer than they should have to make sure that things were getting done. She recalls there was this artist that worked on the game 𝐂𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐂𝐓. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. I think it also has an anime. Some of the art would go out, get done by somebody else. Like she said that he also was an important part of like fixing some of the mistakes that they made. And a lot of the art that person made, she was like, I fell in love with it, and this is why we had him on the team. I think he did work on both Streets of Rage 2 and 3. We talked about a little bit earlier with the color palettes for these games. The Mega Drive had 4 16 color palettes, and they would use 2 for characters and 2 for backgrounds. That's what she said, right? But then the interviewer was like, but wait, there's some enemies that have like 3 and 4 colors, like Signal, for example. He comes in yellow, red, green. Like he was like, but there's some enemies that come in, and she was like, oh yeah, we probably use some of those colors too. And it was like just like a funny moment, because she was like, no, this is what they did, and then she was like, oh wait, oh yeah, we did that too. So that was the reason. That was a big reason why like they did sprite swaps, because like there were only 4 of the 16 color palettes, whereas in the Super Nintendo, I think it was like 32 color palettes. One of the things that was difficult for her that she wished the Mega Drive had was transparencies. Whatever, like I guess like the artwork, like I don't know how this part works, but like there's, I guess when you're making like the art, you could do like transparent layers or whatever. They couldn't do that, the Mega Drive or the Sega Genesis version. You could do that for the Super Nintendo and the Famicom, but the Mega Drive didn't have that. The Mega Drive had a higher pixel resolution. They had like some advantages with some over the other. In Streets of Rage 3, there was supposed to be motorcycles. Oh yeah, we touched on that earlier. I don't know why I made a note here in the dev part when I should have made it in the lore part, but I'm gonna go back and just read the note here, because this goes, when the game was localized from original Japanese version to the English language release, significant changes were made. The clothing of the 3 returning heroes was altered from their original colors. Female enemy characters wore less revealing outfit, and a sub-boss named Ash was removed from the English version. The voice effects were also changed. Most notably, Axel's catchphrase of Grand Upper, which I always thought he said Grandpapa, but he says Grand Upper. His blitz move being replaced with bare knuckle. So instead of saying Grand Upper, he says bare knuckle, which I also thought was cool that there are voice lines in this game. She said her brother recorded a lot of the voice lines except for Blaze. Blaze being the only girl character. I guess they hired somebody else to do the voice acting for Blaze. Another notable difference between the two games is the plot, right? And this is where I was going before with the explosive substance called Vaccine, discovered by a character named Dr. Gilbert, who is revealed to be the true identity of Dr. Zan, which explodes in the city and kills thousands of people. This is why they changed it, because of the explosion that killed thousands of people. And at the time, a military general named Ivan Petrov vanishes, and is later discovered Mr. X orchestrated the general's disappearance and uses Vaccine, which is that chemical, to start a global war. In the English version, they change it to, instead of that Ivan guy, it's the chief of police. And then they change all of like the evildoers from people to robots, and they take out like the whole blowing up and killing thousands of people thing, which admittedly enough, if that was left in a video game made for kids, I think that was maybe a good idea, because that probably would have messed with my little emotions back then. So lastly, I'll touch on Streets of Rage 4, which was originally going to be a remaster, but then .emu asked Sega for permission for a sequel, and they let them. And I guess because of their track record with Wonder Boy, because they remade Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap, which I recently just played and beat. It's so good. I also played the remaster because everyone told me like, oh yeah, the remaster is really good. And then I found out like .emu was that same company. So it's like, oh man, even better. They redid it. And the cool thing is that like you could press a button and automatically go from like original visuals to the new visuals. So like they had a really good track record already. They were the ones that developed Streets of Rage 4. And for the characters, there's at least 1,000 frames of animation for each character and 300 to 400 for each enemy. And everything is hand drawn, really beautiful, really, really nice fluid art style. The game, I think, started development in 2018 and was released in 2020 to critical acclaim. That's what I know about Streets of Rage 4, and that is my dev story for all of the games.
How amazing though, like what a super cool synopsis of everything, because there were so many intricacies as a part of that. Because again, like we were talking about in Turtles 4, they had to change it from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, and then they had to change from the Japanese version. Okay, a pretty interesting plot line of the city's gonna blow up and it killed thousands of people. And like, no, we're gonna change that for the US, that it's a bunch of robots, and let's just cut out the whole explosion thing. We don't need to talk about that,
Yeah, and then especially when you also come to find out, not only that, but like Mr. X is just a brain controlling like all this stuff going on, like making this like weird like science lab or whatever. I'm like, oh, okay, this sounds like something like from a Hideo Kojima game. Like this is like really like intense.